All right, so welcome to another deep dive. And today, like we always do, we're going to be looking at kind of a unique and surprising set of sources.
Definitely.
But it should be interesting. This is going to be fun.
Absolutely, yeah.
So on the one hand, we're going to be taking a look at some very recent research and developments in terms of like how the latest COVID variant spreads.
Okay.
And then kind of on a totally different level, we're going to look at this Twitter thread from a wedding DJ who calls himself at Kirby Crackle.
Okay.
Now, you might be thinking, what in the world does a wedding DJ have to teach us about the latest COVID variant?
Right.
But actually, when you look at these sources together, there's this really fascinating kind of convergence in terms of personal choice, personal responsibility, and kind of the evolving, landscape of how we deal with COVID.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's really interesting how these two sources, even though they're coming from such different perspectives, really do kind of highlight that tension between individual choices and how those choices then ripple out and affect the larger community.
Right, and it's all happening, against this backdrop of an evolving virus, new variants, new data.
Yeah.
So really a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, for sure.
So to kind of get us started, let's dig into this research a little bit.
Okay.
And one of the things that really stood out was this idea about fomite transmission.
Right.
That's basically picking up the virus from surfaces. And the research is basically showing that, it's just not as big of a concern anymore compared to airborne transmission.
Yeah, I mean, I think back to the early days of the pandemic when we were all, wiping down our groceries, leaving packages outside for days.
Oh, yeah.
And now it seems like the science has really shifted to that airborne transmission as being the primary mode of spread.
Right. So it's not to say that we shouldn't wash our hands, but the emphasis is really, on what we're breathing.
Exactly.
And speaking of taking precautions, that's where our wedding DJ, Kirby Crackle, comes in.
Yeah.
And this Twitter thread was really interesting because this DJ really goes above and beyond in terms of creating what they call clean air events.
Yeah. It was really impressive, going through the thread and just seeing the level of detail and the range of precautions that they take. I mean, we're not just talking about, your basic cloth mask here.
Oh, yeah.
They're wearing N95 masks. They're wearing eye protection. They're even using nasal spray.
Wow.
And then, going a step further, PCR testing before and after the events, which I think for most people, PCR tests maybe bring back memories of those early days of the pandemic, the long lines. But, they're still considered the gold standard when it comes to accuracy in terms of detecting the virus.
Right. So it was like this whole personal protocol, this whole safety routine.
Absolutely.
It's pretty impressive, Yeah.
Yeah, it's really comprehensive.
And then there's the tech. So, you got the usual suspects, the air purifiers to kind of clean the air, CO2 monitors to measure ventilation. But then there's this one that I was like, whoa, I've never even heard of this. They use these far UVC lamps.
Yeah, that was really interesting, to see that they're incorporating this pretty cutting edge technology. And I'm guessing that most of our listeners probably haven't encountered far UVC before either.
Right.
But, what's really fascinating about it is that specifically at this wavelength of 222 nanometers, it can actually neutralize airborne pathogens, including viruses without, harming human skin or eyes.
Wow. So it's like this invisible shield that's just zapping these virus particles out of the air.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And, it might seem kind of like futuristic technology, but it's actually, it's being implemented in various places now.
That's amazing. But I have to ask, like 222 nanometers, why is that specific number so important?
Yeah, so it really comes down to how light, interacts with biological materials. So at that specific wavelength, the light is able to penetrate, and kind of disable the virus, but it doesn't have enough energy to actually reach and damage the living cells in, our skin or in our eyes.
Oh, interesting.
So it's kind of like that Goldilocks scenario.
Yeah.
Just the right wavelengths to be effective, but also safe for humans.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've got this DJ decked out in, protective gear, using all this high-tech equipment, creating this little clean air bubble, basically, at these weddings. It's pretty impressive, but I imagine not everyone is thrilled about this level of precaution,
Yeah.
Especially in a setting like a wedding where people are there to celebrate.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it's something that Kirby Crackle addresses really directly in their Twitter thread. They talk about the pushback that they get for taking these precautions. Things like, why are you wearing that? Or hasn't anyone told you it's over? And, it really highlights this social pressure that exists to kind of conform even when maybe our personal risk assessments or our comfort levels are different.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people can probably relate to that, feeling that pressure to kind of go along with what everyone else is doing, whether it's about
Yeah.
COVID or any other situation where you feel like you're going against the grain.
Absolutely. I think anytime someone makes a choice that maybe deviates from what's perceived as, quote unquote normal, there's always that potential for judgment or for questioning.
Hmm.
And that can be, honestly pretty isolating and just emotionally draining.
Right. And Kirby Crackle actually even goes so far as to say that they feel, you know, othered sometimes, especially by like other vendors at these weddings and
Yeah.
even some of the guests. And it's almost like their, very visible efforts to mitigate risk are just like a constant reminder of something that people maybe would rather not think about.
Right. I think it reflects kind of this, broader societal trend, this kind of urge to minimize risk, to return to this sense of normalcy, even when, maybe the evidence suggests otherwise. We see this with, mask wearing, discussions about long COVID, even climate change.
Right.
Like there's this desire to just kind of go back to how things were before.
Right. And that disconnect can be really tough to navigate, both on a personal level and then also socially. And I'm curious, like from your perspective, what do you think are some of those kind of long-term psychological effects of constantly being othered, for prioritizing your personal safety?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question and something that, deserves a lot more attention and research. But I think we can imagine, constantly having to explain your choices, facing that judgment, feeling like you don't belong. I mean, over time, that can lead to, you know, feelings of anxiety, even a sense of distrust in those social situations. And for some people, they might even start to internalize those negative messages and, question their own judgment.
Right. So it's almost like this constant state of hypervigilance,
Yeah.
where you're always kind of on guard, waiting for those negative reactions.
Exactly. And it can be incredibly exhausting to live like that, to always feel like you're having to defend yourself and your choices.
Yeah. And I imagine that emotional burden, it's not evenly distributed.
Right.
I mean, some people are just more vulnerable to these psychological
Mhm.
effects, maybe because of pre-existing mental health conditions or maybe just past experiences with trauma or discrimination.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that's really important to acknowledge that this isn't just an abstract issue, but it's something that's affecting real people in very real ways.
Right. It's like this added layer of stress on top of everything else. And Kirby Crackle actually brings this up in their thread, too. They talk about, you know, their privilege, basically, in being able to take all these precautions.
Right.
They recognize that not everyone has the resources or the social support to do the same.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. And it brings us to the question of equity, right?
Yeah.
How do we address the fact that access to these preventative measures is often determined by socioeconomic factors?
Yeah. So it's like this double whammy where not only do certain individuals face greater risks, maybe because of their circumstances, but they also have fewer options for protecting themselves.
Exactly. And I think it really underscores the need for a multi-pronged approach.
Hmm.
We need to address individual behaviors, but we also need to look at those broader societal structures that create these disparities in the first place.
Right. So it's about changing the game, not just playing by the existing rules.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture of care and safety that extends beyond just personal choices and really embraces this idea of collective good.
And that's where I think Kirby Crackle's story becomes even more interesting. It's not just about their own journey, but it's about inspiring a broader shift in how we think about public health and personal responsibility.
Right.
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 And this idea that our choices really do have an impact, not just on ourselves, but on the people around us.
It challenges us to think beyond those individualistic frameworks and really embrace this idea of interconnectedness, that our well-being is tied to the well-being of those around us.
And it all starts, with recognizing that we all have a role to play.
Absolutely.
But then there's this other really interesting part of Kirby Crackle's story that I wanted to touch on, this idea of perspective. They talk about how these experiences, even though they've been challenging, have actually given them a new understanding of what it means to be marginalized.
Right.
And I thought that was really profound. It's like by constantly having to navigate that social pressure, defend their choices, they've kind of caught a glimpse into what it's like for people who face those kinds of challenges on a daily basis, maybe because of their race or their gender, their disability.
It's like they've been forced to confront the reality that normal is a very subjective and often exclusive concept.
Right. And that we need to be more aware of those diverse experiences and perspectives, even if we haven't personally lived through them. And Kirby Crackle actually describes this new perspective as like a gift, which I think is a really beautiful way to frame it. It's this opportunity for growth and for empathy and honestly for just like deepening our understanding of, the human experience.
Yeah. And it's a reminder that even in the midst of those really difficult circumstances, there's always something to be learned. There's always something to be gained.
Okay, so let's recap for a second. We've got this wedding DJ who's taking these extraordinary precautions to create these clean air events, navigating this social pressure and judgment, and ultimately, using these experiences to cultivate empathy and advocate for a more inclusive approach to safety. It's pretty inspiring, wouldn't you say?
It really is. And I think it challenges us to think about how we can each, in our own way, contribute to creating a safer and more understanding world.
Right, and that brings us to the next part of our conversation where we're going to delve even deeper into Kirby Crackle's efforts to normalize acts of care and clean air mitigation. Because they're not just talking the talk, they're really out there trying to change the game.
Yeah, and I'm really curious to explore those specific actions and what we can learn from their approach.
Me too.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible how Kirby Crackle is, really pushing for change beyond just their own actions. They're really trying to shift this whole conversation around, clean air and safety precautions.
Yeah, and this idea of normalizing these acts of care, showing that clean air mitigation can be a part of any event. Really, it's not just about weddings, it's more like a mindset.
Absolutely. And they're not just, talking about it. They're actually out there doing it week after week. They're showing people that you can create safer spaces, even in, a setting like a wedding where people are usually focused on celebrating and having fun.
Right. You don't have to sacrifice fun to be safe. Like you can have both. And that's a great message, especially now when, everyone's kind of craving that return to normalcy, but also wants to feel safe.
Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting is that Kirby Crackle's approach isn't about, like forcing people to do things or being restrictive. It's more about like providing information, giving options, empowering people to make their own choices. They even talk about working with the couples and the venues to come up with creative solutions that work for each event.
It was like a collaborative effort.
Totally. It's not about, you must do this. It's more like, here's how we can work together to make this a safe and enjoyable experience for everyone.
Right. And that approach, I think, is really key, to shifting those social norms and that sense of like collective responsibility. When people feel like they're part of the solution, they're more likely to embrace those changes.
For sure.
And speaking of empowerment, Kirby Crackle really emphasizes this idea of individual choices as a form of public health engagement.
Yeah, I thought that was a really powerful point.
Like, we might not all be able to install fancy UVC lamps, but we can all do something, right?
Right, and it's a much more empowering message than, just telling people what to do. It's about, giving them the tools and the knowledge to make those decisions for themselves.
Like, even those small acts of care can add up, wearing a mask, getting tested, staying home when you're sick.
Yeah, it's the ripple effect. All those individual actions, when you multiply them across a community, can have a real impact on public health.
So it's not just about following the rules. It's about actively participating in creating a healthier future.
Exactly. We're not just passive bystanders. We all have a role to play.
And that brings us back to that idea of normalizing care, right? Like making those choices that prioritize safety and well-being, just a normal thing to do.
And that normalization can be so powerful. When we see other people doing it, it makes us more likely to do it ourselves, and it creates this more supportive environment for everyone.
It's like a positive feedback loop. The more people do it, the more normal it becomes.
Absolutely. And I think that's what's so powerful about Kirby Crackle's message. It's not just about the specific things they're doing, but about this bigger picture of, personal responsibility, caring for each other, and just normalizing those acts of kindness and consideration.
Yeah, and that's a message that really goes beyond just COVID, It's about infectious disease, chronic illness, mental health. It's about basic human decency, really.
Absolutely, and it's a reminder that even when things are tough, even when you're facing pushback, you can still choose to be that positive force in the world.
You can choose to care.
Exactly.
Now, we've talked a lot about like the social and emotional side of things, but I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that there's also some pretty amazing technology at play here, with that far UVC stuff.
Yeah, that's a great point.
It's not just about, individual choices. It's also about how we can use technology to create safer spaces.
And Kirby Crackle's use of far UVC is such a great example of that, you know? It's a real-world example of how scientific innovation can help us address public health challenges.
Right. And this technology has the potential to be truly game-changing.
Yeah,
We've already talked about how it works, zapping those virus particles, but it's really groundbreaking stuff.
it really is.
I mean, imagine a world where clean air is just like a given, accessible to everyone. Far UVC could make that happen.
And it's not just theoretical anymore, it's happening right now.
And if a wedding DJ can use it at a wedding reception, think about all the other places, right? Schools, offices, restaurants, hospitals, even on planes.
The possibilities are endless. And that's what's so inspiring about this story, you know? It's not just about mitigating risk in one setting, it's about expanding our vision of what's possible and really pushing those boundaries to create a healthier future for everyone.
Yeah, like sparking a movement, a shift in how we think about well-being and how we can use technology to improve our lives.
Absolutely.
So as we're wrapping up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with this question. What possibilities does this story, spark for you? What steps can you take, big or small, to create those safer and healthier spaces in your own life?
Yeah, we encourage you to keep exploring this topic, challenge those assumptions and think about how you might apply these ideas to your own life.
Even small steps can lead to big changes. It's wild to think we started talking about a DJ and now we're talking about clean air, like everywhere. It just shows you how these conversations can go in all sorts of directions.
Yeah, I mean, that's what makes these deep dives so fun, right? You never know where you're going to end up.
Totally. And it just shows you how these individual stories, like Kirby Crackles, can spark these much bigger conversations about, like, what we can all be doing.
Absolutely, yeah.
And one thing that really stuck with me is that, we don't have to wait for, like, someone to tell us what to do. We can just start creating those safer spaces ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. And those actions, they might seem small, but they can actually lead to much bigger changes.
Right, like Kirby Crackle, right.
Yep.
Just by doing what they're doing, they're showing everyone that there's a different way to do things. And who knows, maybe that'll inspire other people to follow suit. Other DJs, other venues, maybe even like whole industries.
It's that ripple effect, right? And it all starts with individuals taking those first steps.
Exactly. And I think that's something we can all learn from.
Yeah.
We might not all have fancy technology or a huge platform, but we all have the power to make choices that, reflect our values.
Yeah, whether it's speaking up about safety concerns or supporting businesses that are doing things the right way, or even just making those informed choices in your own life.
Yeah, all those little things add up.
And I think that's really the takeaway here, that we're not powerless. We all have a role to play in creating that world that we want to see.
So as we wrap up, I'm curious, like, what are you taking away from this whole conversation?
That's a good question. I think for me, it's that reminder that, we all have agency. Like, we can actually make a difference. And innovation can be a really powerful force for good.
That's great. I love that. And for our listeners out there, I just want to leave you with this one last thought. If a DJ can create clean air events in the middle of, a crowded dance floor, what possibilities does that open up for you? Like, where else can you create safer spaces?
Yeah, just imagine the possibilities, right?
Yeah. Keep exploring, keep challenging those assumptions and think about how you can apply these ideas to your own life.
Because even those small steps can lead to big changes.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
And until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.